Hi friends, so I am here today to talk with you about the IHOPKC Firefly Report. I mentioned it in a recent video and I'm sure some of you have already heard commentary on it or even read the report. I received the report on Monday night, which was this past Monday, which would have been I think February 3rd. And I have gone through it a couple of times and I wanted to just get my thoughts together before I came on here and made a video about it. If you have never watched any of my videos and you don't know who I am, let me introduce myself. My name is Vanessa Johnson. I'm an attorney. I have experience as a child essay prosecutor. I am in Florida. I actually have experience with IHOPKC. When I started making videos on YouTube, I started with Daystar. And before that, I was just feeling in my spirit that I wanted to speak out about IHOPKC, but I really didn't do that publicly. It wasn't until Daystar that I have been vocal. So what my point is here and what my aim and goal is to just provide some commentary on the report and just discuss in general the things that we're seeing in this report, what was investigated, what the allegations were, things like that. And I hope that this helps. You know, all of my videos are with the intent to help from a godly perspective as an attorney. I'm hoping that, you know, I can answer questions. I know a lot of people have asked questions and have commented that the content on here is helpful for them to just look at things in a way. And I am not in any way saying that my way is the only way. I think that people need to do their own research. They need to just be aware and awake in this season right now. There's so much going on and there's so much exposure. And so that's what this is about. That's why I'm here. So I just want to give you a little bit of background as to my experience with IHOP. I didn't live in Kansas City. I was never on staff there, but I had friends that lived there that were part of the ministry. They were either on staff or they were just there for the prayer room, or they were just there to go to conferences. And so I would describe it for me as someone who, I did consider that as my church, so to speak, but I always would have a local church. But in 2006, I started going there and going to the prayer room and going to conferences. And I had a friend that I lived with in 2006, 2007, before I got married in 2008. And she really is the one that introduced me to IHOPKC and to people there. And she and I would go to conferences, but when I lived with her, a lot of times when we were at home, we would watch DVDs. I remember having DVDs of Mike Bickle, but then eventually, you know, when we could watch it online, we did watch it online. I remember that. I remember that we used to have to pay for the subscription for the prayer room. So we did that until it was free. So, you know, if you are not familiar with IHOPKC, it's a ministry called International House of Prayer in Kansas City. And they are a prayer ministry, but they have other ministries there. And they have musicians, singers, missionaries on staff, teaching, a university. They don't have everything now. I don't really know exactly what they have left. I think that they still are running the prayer room. I'm not quite sure, but the prayer room was 24/7, and they would have worship teams that would worship. And, you know, I enjoyed that. I can't even tell you how many hours I've spent in that prayer room, or even just watching online. It's a lot. And I loved it. And in my, you know, there was nothing like it that I had experienced. There's prayer rooms that have popped up, you know, even in Florida, but there was nothing that I could say compared to that, where it was 24/7 and it was just set up the way that it was. But so back to how I became aware of, you know, a lot of the things that are in this report. And by the way, this is going to be linked in the description box because I want you all to have access to it and read it yourselves, go through it. Because I think that, and you'll hear me say this throughout this video, I think it's a manuscript. It's helpful. It's a handbook. It's how you, we're getting a bird's eye view into what churches, anybody should not be doing to our children. So going back to how I got involved or how I was made aware of what was going on. It was on October 28th, 2023, because it was a Saturday, and a friend of mine called me and she told me about all of these things that were said. A lot of the and some of the things that I learned are not even contained in this report. So I don't know what's going to happen with that or if anything. But you know what, as we have this report, it's a good report. It's a very thorough report, a very well laid out report. But you know, not everything gets reported, not everything gets included. So we have to keep that in mind as we go through it. But so when I was just listening, there was never a doubt in my mind that even though I respected Mike Bickle, I looked up to him, I thought that he was a great leader, I loved his teachings, I loved IHOPKC, I loved my friends that were there. When I just let her talk and I just listened. And there was never a second that I didn't believe her. And she was telling me about what the victims were saying. The advocate group, which were the people that were advocating for the victims and trying to seek justice and going to the ELT, the executive leadership team at IHOP, and talking to Mike Bickle and things like that. So there was never, you know, a question that it happened. Is it upsetting? Yeah. It's disturbing, of course. But I did not think for a minute that they were untrue. And I don't even know these people. And you're going to see a stark contrast because the ELT and they knew these people and they chose a side. So hearing that, my first thing, because, you know, I'm a lawyer and my inquiry mode kicks in, and I was like, did anybody call the police? And, you know, not realizing that these people, at least the ones I was hearing about at that time, were adults, and when it occurred, they were adults. So we're just processing that, just talking about where this was going. And over the course of the next few weeks, I would talk to my friend about things that were coming out. And I mean, this went on for months. And then if you were a part of it, you would see that then people were coming out online and on YouTube, and there was, you know, articles, there was videos at the end of 2023 and into 2024. And, you know, what really bothered me during that time were the attacks against the victims, the attacks against the advocate group. That really angered me. These are righteous people, and they are standing for righteousness, and yet they are being attacked. And I'm going to stand with them, and I'm not going to go away just because people don't like that. So it's really interesting, even after this report has come out, I don't think that any of those persecutors or those people that were perceived to be friends of the AG or the victims, whether they have ever publicly apologized to them, which I think is really telling of their true nature. You're going to hear throughout the Firefly Report, the ELT then that was existing at that time is Stuart Greaves, David Slyker, and Lenny LaGuardia is mentioned. I'm not quite sure if he was actually ELT or not, but it doesn't matter. These are people that are going to be mentioned throughout. And you know what? It's extremely troubling because everything that I've heard, you know, they're covering up for Mike. They're covering up for people that abused people that were at IHOPKC, whether they were interns or you know, children. They were abused and they covered it up. And I don't know today what Mike Bickle or any of those people are doing. I have no idea, but I would say at the very least, if you see them attempting to lead or minister, run. Do not be a part of it, because even after this report, again, I mean, I'm not aware of them coming out and apologizing. So we should take that into consideration for sure. So I'm going to share with you my thoughts and impressions of this report. It's an independent investigation that began at the end of 2023 that resulted in the findings that are contained in that report. So prior to Firefly getting involved with, I don't know if I'm saying it right, Tikkun, Tikkun, they entered into an agreement. I'll talk about that in a minute, but Firefly did the investigation. But before that, there was a so-called investigation at least once or twice, or even maybe 3 times. And it wasn't an independent investigation, and the victims were not a part of it, because what they did was they hired attorneys. Now, I never saw the retainer agreements, but typically I'm an attorney, there's a retainer agreement, and it spells out what your roles are, your duties are. And just inherently as an attorney, you have a fiduciary duty to your client. You're going to act in their best interest. You're going to put them in the light most favorable. And so, that's what attorneys do. So even though I know, and I mean, for myself, my strong suit is investigations. My strong suit is interviews. That's really what I'm very good at. And I know that I could perform an investigation. I could perform interviews, but an attorney would probably not be the best suited in this situation, just because they would be answering to somebody and they would not be truly independent. So it was wise. It was, I'm sure, God ordained that they were able to find Firefly to do this investigation. So, for example, I wouldn't be able, in that circumstance with IHOPKC, I wouldn't be someone that would be deemed independent, not only because I'm an attorney, but because I completely believed the victims. And I was not very happy with what I was hearing about Mike Bickle and the ELT, so I would not be deemed independent. We see that as an attorney, you probably hear about this with judges, right? If you're in a court case and a judge might have a friendship. Oh, we just saw this, right? Well, it wasn't a judge, but it was the AG with the Cassis. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly now. I was tearing it up, as I have a tendency to do. I can't pronounce names. But in any event, we saw that with the AG, who came out and said that he couldn't, or his office couldn't investigate because he had a conflict of interest. He was friends with Drenda, and or, because of her position as a Knox County commissioner. So when that happens, then there's a conflict, right? So then it goes to an investigator that doesn't have a conflict. So, we see that with judges too. That could happen where a party might have a conflict, or the judge knows somebody. When you're picking a jury, that's one of the first questions that's asked in voir dire. That's when we're questioning that panel, potential jury, and we're asking them questions, and we identify who all the witnesses are, all the parties, always. The first thing is, do you know the prosecutor? Do you know the judge? Do you know the defense attorney? Do you know these people? Because if you do, then you cannot be considered an independent actor in that role as a juror. So, all right, going back to the Firefly Report. It starts out with the introduction, and it defines the scope of the investigation. They said that they received over 224 intakes and identified and interviewed 32 survivors who were SA'd or who experienced SA misconduct during their time at IHOPKC. The investigators say that the credibility of the report was founded on the collective and corroborating testimony of the experiences of the victims and the witnesses. So some of the victims did not want to be named. They remained anonymous, and so they were referred to as IS. That referenced the interviewed survivor. And then there were ones that were interviewed as witnesses and they were referred to as IW, and you'll see that in the report. There were references to staff members who were implicated in SA or misconduct or cover-up, and they're referred to as ASM. And that stands for accused staff member. So one thing you're going to see in this report, if you read it, it's just glaringly obvious. Mike Bickle did not participate. Neither did any of these accused staff members. They did not participate, which I think is very interesting. On page 5 of the report, if you read it, you'll see that Firefly makes a disclaimer, and they state that they had no restrictions placed on them. That's very important. That means that they had free reign. They conducted the interview as they thought fit, and they did not have any parameters. That establishes that they are truly independent. So knowing that they're truly independent, I would ask Mike Bickle and others that did not participate, why? If you're entering into this truly independent investigation, why did you not participate in that? I think that his silence is quite deafening, and even more, it's just outrageous. We're well past a year, still nothing except for his pathetic release of a letter in December of 2023. And it's even more pathetic that not only has he not come out and apologized, repented, he still has people that back him, his diehard supporters. All right, so Firefly mentions documents that they analyzed, that they were extensive. I don't know the number of the pages, it's not included, but they refer to over 6,000 documents. That's considerable. They entered into an engagement agreement with TQN, if I'm saying it right, International on September 5th, 2024, and it defined Firefly's scope of investigation, which was to investigate the allegations of SA against Mike Bickle and others in leadership, and to investigate the cover-up of any alleged SA or abuse connected with IHOPKC that was reported to their leadership. The report describes how IHOPKC started talking about, like what I said in the beginning. They have thousands and thousands of people that were there, coming there. I don't know how many they had on staff, but they had, the prayer room and worship and missionaries. And they do state that they made multiple attempts to contact the current board members for comments, and they received no response. So in my opinion, choosing to be part of a leader, or, to be a leader in ministry, it subjects you to certain things. I think, I can't remember which video I talked about this, but being a godly leader, and I left out the most important, being a servant. So thank you to those who commented and said, you left something out. You're right, I did. To be a godly leader, you have to be a servant. And there's no indicators of that when we go through this report as it relates to Mike Bickle or the ELT. They're not a servant. They're interested in protecting themselves, their reputations, their money. We hear that constantly with people that are coming out and accusing those who are talking and saying that we're after money. I'm not making any money off this. And I'm sure not the people that are, if they do have channels that are making some money, I don't know how that really works yet. I haven't looked into it yet. And if I do, I do. If I don't, I don't. I don't know. But that's a dumb thing to say, because you're just assuming it. You're assuming that people are making money. And then let's just point the finger right back at you with your big ministry and, asking people for money. And I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent or a sidebar here, but what if you go to your church leader, your pastor, and say, hey, instead of me tithing to the church this week, I'd like to, your janitor or whoever on your staff that needs money, I'd like to tithe directly to them. Just evaluate their expression or their response. I think that would be telling. They might be offended at that. So getting back to, if you are a leader in a church, I think that there are certain requirements. We know what they are, but it's amazing that people are still in operation and they're not taking care of their flock, and they are covering up abuse and corruption. And for the first thing, if somebody comes to you with a report of a crime potentially, they should be telling that person to go to the police. And you're going to see exactly the opposite here in this report. IHOPKC, go to the police? Oh, no. Don't go to the police. They tell them exactly the opposite. And, as a church leader, if somebody were to come to you, you should believe the victim. Exactly the opposite of IHOPKC. Not only not believe them, but abuse them more. That's what they did. Call them names. Tell them that they're gossiping and that they're liars. Deny it. Deflect. Make them out to be the bad guy, right? We need steps for these leaders to be held accountable, but they're the ones in charge of their own ministries. And we see that they don't even have anything in place to be held accountable. And really, they're just not interested in that. So that just should tell you something. And I just want to stop here to tell you about my personal experience. It's very limited because I think I've had maybe 2 or 3 or 4 times that I actually spoke to Mike Bickle. I mean, I really didn't, and I try to look back in all this to see if there was any red flags. Of course, I'm going to do that. But I really didn't. One thing that did stand out to me was when I watched teachings, Mike Bickle, Ellen Hood, Dave Sliker, Stuart Greaves. I recall them really, the theme a lot of times, humility, being humble. Now remove Alan Hood from what I'm about to say, because I do believe Alan Hood is absolutely a picture of a humble, godly leader. Absolutely. But the other 3, they didn't practice what they preached. I remember, I can't remember when, but it was obviously after October of 2023. It was probably a few months later. So maybe I don't know, February, March, April, May, no, it was probably before that. Maybe, I don't know, the early part of 2024. I remember Dave Sliker going on Facebook, and it wasn't an apology, and I can't remember because he's blocked me and, removed me. And so he came out and said something about the victims. It certainly wasn't an apology. So I remember people were going after him, me being one of them, and saying, did you go to Jane Doe? Did you go to her? And did you apologize? Why are you on here now? Did you do that before you did this? Well, he deleted all my comments because I can be a little intense. And then he blocked me. So I don't remember exactly what it was. And if any of you remember, comment. But in any event, he did come out and say something, and I remember people going after him. So I didn't see any humility at all whatsoever on the part of Stuart Greaves, Dave Sliker, Lenny LaGuardia. I've met him too. Again, there was nothing that I could really point to that would be a red flag. So, what's really troubling is after all this. So then when Dave Sliker and Stuart Greaves, they left the ELT, then there was Kurt Fuller, General Kurt Fuller, who was the ELT, and he stated that the advocate group were a bunch of liars and said that all of these accounts are just consensual conduct, attacking the victims once again. So we have victims coming forward, and they're recounting what happened to them decades ago. They're looking back quite some time. And, we know now that Jane Doe is Deborah. And she says, because she was interviewed recently by Julie Roys, and she says that when she was listening to a victim of Bill Cosby, it sparked something to cause her to eventually disclose to her husband. And then she disclosed to a friend, and then she disclosed to Alan Hood. And Alan Hood, his response was just perfect. I think it's a picture of Jesus, because he was weeping and wailing with her uncontrollably. And I think that that's what Jesus was doing too. He would be weeping and wailing. He probably is now over all of these victims that are, first of all, going through the abuse and then re-victimized by these horrible, ungodly, demonic people that refuse to take responsibility, refuse to repent, refuse to take action to make the wrongs right, and then go on and slander them. So it's just absolutely horrendous. So throughout the report, Firefly repeatedly addresses the patterns of abuse. You'll see that. And on page 9, they made multiple attempts. They said they made multiple attempts to contact Mike Bickle, and of course, nothing. And I would say that if you're not outraged after reading this report, then something might be wrong. I was just outraged. I mean, and I knew of this stuff, and I even know of more stuff, and it's outrageous. And the cover up to me is what's so egregious. You know, I've said this before. I have to admit, you know, I'm one of those that probably, you know, just contributed to these leaders. Well, and you know, to some extent, I mean, we do it all collectively, but I have to admit my part in thinking that Mike Bickle was such a great guy and these people are above reproach. And, you know, I repented for that, and I continue to, because that mindset is, I think, what has got us here. And, you know, I drank that Kool-Aid, and, you know, I think to myself, how could I be so dumb? And, you know, I'm not going to beat myself up. We all can get duped. We've seen it, you know, and even now, like, even in my job, you know, I have to give people the benefit of the doubt until I know otherwise. So that's how I operate, because I don't want to be someone that's hard and, you know, that doesn't believe everybody. I have to believe people. And I'm not going to be one that abuses people. I don't do that. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to just tell it as it is. And that's just how I am. You know, I'm quite assertive, and maybe you've seen that before in my videos. I have to be as a lawyer. That's just the way it is. And, you know, we all have different personalities. I might not be somebody that you want to listen to, and that's okay. We all have our own style. You know, there's people that I like to listen to more than others, but I've said this before. I like to listen to all sorts of people, even secular, because I can learn from everybody. So, you know, again, I said, you know, when I came out on here, it was because of Daystar. So even right before Daystar came out, I was still struggling with just my emotions with IHOP. And I even reached out to a friend, and he gave me a comforting message, because I was having issues with the prophetic. So, you know, I'm just going to say that, you know, a real pet peeve of mine is, and this is the only thing, because I said that, you know, I just didn't find a red flag. The only thing of mine that I could recall when I would look back about Mike Bickle is, because for the most part, I would see him on stage by himself, but there were times that he would call people up on stage, and, you know, he would mostly, he has to be the center of attention. And I acknowledged that back then. And he would often cut people off, not allow them to talk, speak over them. I thought that was quite rude. And I just thought that that was his personality. And I did find it arrogant. And so I would attribute that to him then. But that's just one. You know, if I'm looking to identify somebody, or, you know, think that there might be a problem, there has to be a cluster of a couple of things going on. And I didn't find that. But then, you know, as years went on, even before this exposure, a friend of mine had shared some things with me, and it wasn't about SA, but it was just about his personality. And I had concluded that he was narcissistic at that time. But again, just because of that, I had no idea at the time that SA was going on. I had no idea. So, all right. So the majority of the report, it discusses the SA. It discusses the details of it. It discusses the grooming, and to me, the gaslighting. And if you've followed the IHOPKC scandal and the advocate group, you know, their statement came out, and then Mike Bickle decided to come out with his statement in December of 2023. And his letter was just horrendous because it just doesn't admit anything. You know, a lot of people, when they're accused of something, they'll take a truth, but then they'll minimize it. And that's exactly what he did. And I've talked about this before. You know, that's where you could draw the line. And for me, watching it on Facebook of people that I knew that had some part in it, maybe they'd never been there, but they followed Mike Bickle or IHOPKC, and then they posted Mike Bickle's ridiculous letter. It was so gut-wrenching. Instead of taking the stand for the victims, they chose Mike Bickle. And we see it all the time. And I would see that constantly, praying for you, Mike. We love you, Mike. And it was just like, I just wanted to vomit. It was just not once about the victims, not once. And we see that a lot. So, you know, these people that claim to be Christians, I cannot tolerate lies. I just don't have an affinity for it. Simple as that. I don't like it. And I don't care if you're my friend, and you're not anymore, because if we can't agree on just the simplest of things, how do we have a conversation? How do we have a relationship? I can't have a relationship with a liar. If I know you to be a liar, we're not going to have any common ground, because we have to first agree on some things, some basic principles. And if you are a liar, I just can't do that with you. So I just can't see how I can fellowship with somebody like that. So let's get back to the report. It mentions the victims, and some of them, they do not say their names, but some of them they do. Tammy Woods, who was a minor, she was age 14 when Mike started his grooming. References Terry Hartley, who was age 15, and I believe that their parents were also groomed too, because how did he have access to them? And Firefly, you know, talks about Mike's behavior for all these decades, and talks about that there's roughly a 20-year gap. He's 20 years older than his victims, and we see this pattern, you know, over and over again. And the right response, like I've said, you know, when this comes to the leadership team, the wrong response is, oh, you're a gossip, just like we saw with the whistleblowers talking about the Cassis with Drenda Cassis, and one of them said that a minor was spending a lot of time with Tom, and then she just brushed it off as, oh, you're just gossiping. And we all know by now that's wrong. And unfortunately, these things were covered up, and people didn't know. People know now. People are educating themselves. They're listening to stories of victims. Some people are like, oh, I just can't take it anymore. And I get that. It's a lot. And if you don't want to listen to it, that's fine. It's fine. You know, you might not be in a position right now to listen, but someday you might. And I would say that people that are interested in this learning, take this as an opportunity to learn, because that's how we're going to learn. You know, there's in the FBI, there is a unit, the behavioral profiling unit. They learn about serial killers by going into the prisons and interviewing them. They're doing this for a reason. It's not for fun. It's because they're trying to learn the dynamics of those people. Maybe perhaps somebody should, you know, get into the minds of Mike Bickle and all those others. Not that they're too arrogant to ever succumb to that, but, you know, if that is a possibility, I think that, you know, we could learn a lot. But I think that this Firefly report is really good to learn from, because you're going to see what he and others did to groom and to abuse, and how they covered up, how they gaslit. I mean, I don't know if they use that word in there. I couldn't find it, but there's a lot of gaslighting going on. You know, this reminds me of a case that's right now in Boston. It's the Sarah Birchmore case, and I'm following that. I follow quite a few cases that are on court TV or just, you know, in the media, because I'm interested in them, because I used to be a prosecutor. And, you know, especially when it comes to children, victims. So this young girl, she was 12 when she became enrolled in the Explorers program at the local police department, which I believe was the Stoughton Police Department, which is just, I think, south of Boston. And her mom put her in that. I believe that she didn't have the best home life, and perhaps her mom, who then passed away, but perhaps her mom thought that this would be a good way for her to have some, you know, just exposure to, and a curriculum. And unfortunately, she was groomed by several police officers that were mentoring her. And ultimately, she was SA'd when she was maybe 14, 15. And that relationship continued with that police officer, who was married and still is. And then she became pregnant. And, you know, he came to her apartment, and on February 1st, 2021, the allegation is that Farwell, that's his name, killed Birchmore by strangulation. But I must say, for over a year before that, her death was deemed a suicide. She did not take her life. She was planning a baby shower. She was ordering baby clothes. And so this is the indictment, because it's federal and not state, which is interesting, because state is typically where you're going to have the indictment. But here, this, I just took a portion of it, that he did kill Sandra Birchmore with malice aforethought, thinking about it before, willfully, deliberately, maliciously, and with premeditation, and with the intent to prevent the communication by any person to a law enforcement officer of information relating to the commission or possible commission of a federal offense, to it, commission or possible commission under, and it goes under that, and you know, coercion and enticement in violation of wire fraud. She was getting ready to expose him, and so she would become a witness, and so he killed the witness. That's why it's federal, but I'm very happy and pleased that it's federal, because that man is not going to get out of prison. He's waiting for trial. So my point in bringing that up is because as parents, and just people in general, just even if you don't have children, you know children, you know people that have them, you know, just being aware of the signs of systemic abuse, being aware of the grooming and the gaslighting is really important. And it's happening right now. People are there, they want more information. Matter of fact, I did a grooming video, and I will link that as well. Several people asked about it, and that's what caused me to do it. And then someone else asked me to do something even more in depth, which I will, but it will take me some time. Kind of like what she was asking for is like a step-by-step on how to do things protocol-wise in a church. And that will take me some time to do. But the Firefly Report goes on to describe how Mike would have access to his victims. He would isolate them. He would buy them gifts. He would tell them secrets to make them feel special. He would maintain his control over them. He would tell people not to tell others about their relationships. These are the typical grooming behaviors of a bad guy or bad lady. And these people looked up to him, not only like in the secular, you know, we're removing that spiritual part, that prophetic part, which makes this so much more egregious. You know, it could be an uncle. It could be in the Explorers program, a police officer. Hang on, I have to take a drink. Somebody that they look up to. And we trust our children with them. The Firefly Report also goes on and addresses the touching that he would do. He would do this out in public, and he would normalize it. called desensitization. And it looked harmless, such as the hugging, such as the tickling, kissing on the cheek, kissing on the forehead. Mike would do that. I remember one time he grabbed my cheek, and not that he was grooming me. It's just, I think he just made it a habit. That's what he did. It's what he did. And so this is kind of like somewhat of a groomer's handbook, this Firefly Report. You can gain a lot of knowledge from it. So I highly recommend that you look at this. You know, he also would expose himself. He exposed himself to Deborah. He walked out of a shower, Mike Bickle did, and exposed himself. And we saw this with Pete and Baby Lamb. These are their tactics. It's nothing new. I mean, it's just played over and over again. And these things are so egregious, again, when we're dealing with church leaders, because they're manipulating spiritually and with the prophetic, is what we saw Mike do. And Firefly goes on and they discuss Mike Bickle's manipulation with his sermons. And we know about that. He had a sermon early October when he knew what he was being accused of. And he talked about a dark horse and talked about that accusation was coming against him, preparing. You know, he's grooming everybody. He's grooming his congregation. And Firefly says and calls him a master at using prophetic words to gain his victim's trust. And that's what he did over and over again. He started at a young age in his 20s when he was essaying the 14 and 15-year-olds. And they're looking back now. I think they're in their 50s. So they're looking back decades. And it's unfortunate, you know, these victims, they want to please them. They want to be around him. They want to be like him. They all want to emulate him, you know, and that's the problem with this. And it is a good thing to do that if you find the right person, you find a good godly leader, but then it can go sideways and completely derail when you have somebody who is a perpetrator and abusing the ones that are looking up to him. They talk about Mike Bickle's manipulation of Deborah and how he repeatedly told Deborah that Mike Bickle, they mentioned how Mike Bickle would repeatedly say to Deborah, my wife Diane's going to die. And they called this tactic particularly insidious. And I would agree, because he justified his behavior. He used the prophetic. He used his position as a spiritual father. So then the report, you know, this is a long report. It's about 58 pages of the report, and then the rest of it, because it's 68 pages in total. It has some supporting documents in there. It's lengthy. I would not be able to go through each and everything because I would be here for hours. And so I'm trying to sum up these particular areas. So it then transitions on page 34 to the accused staff members that are referred to as ASM. I find their behavior so troubling. In my opinion, I think perpetrators are horrible, right? But I think that the ones that come alongside them and make statements that are supporting them, I think they're even worse. I really do. They really disgust me. So there's, I think, 11 ASM. Let me just go through. Is it 11? Up to 11, yes. And starting on page 34, it goes through these accused staff members and the things that they did. So it's not just Mike Bickle. This is an environment of abuse, systemic. I mean, they are all in a conspiracy of abuse, of covering it up. They don't do anything about it. In fact, they discourage anybody from going to the police. Again, this is where there's other things that happened that I'm aware of that was not in this report. And perhaps they just took what they believed was the most important. I don't know, you know. It talks about there was one accused member who in the 80s, he was accused of essaying somebody. And then when he applied for an internship there, he described it as a inappropriate touching, I think. And then, they eventually, somebody at the ELT, I can't remember who it was, but they reached out to the victim, and the victim was of that, this is years later, and said, you're not qualified to do an independent investigation. So then they called in Grace to do it, and they found that there was inappropriate relationships and cover up. And that was inappropriate, but they didn't take any steps to remedy at that time. And then there's more ASMs, inappropriate relationships with an intern, inappropriate essays, and physical assaults. And then the statements that were made by David Sliker telling people, move forward, forgive. It's all a misunderstanding. You're gossiping. Focus on keeping them quiet. You're holy if you don't talk. And if you talk, you're toxic. I really think that the statements by David Sliker was worse than the statements that Mike Bickle made in his pathetic letter. I'm not saying that one's better than the other. I'm just saying the statements. My point is the statements by David Sliker were absolutely horrendous. Absolutely horrendous. No action taken, all cover up. I think that Jesus is very angry with this. Even with this report, when Deborah came out on the interviews with Julie Roys, she said not one person, that was my understanding. I hope I'm saying it right. I think she said that no one has come to her and apologized and repented. That is beyond troubling to me. And this is where, when people tell us to pray for these kind of perpetrators, it does anger me, because what about the victims? What about the ones that are standing up for the victims? What about the whistleblowers, the advocate groups? We're seeing them come out more and more. That's who I'm praying for. Give them strength, because they are being persecuted. I'm not praying for the ones who persecute. Sorry if that offends you, but I am not. I think that they are evil. They do not appear to me to have the heart of Jesus. On page 46 of the Firefly Report, it focuses on the face-to-face meetings that Mike Bickle and the ELT were requiring under the guise of Matthew 18. Can you imagine? A crime was committed against you and you're being forced to confront the accuser, to tell them what they did so that they can call you a liar. In the secular world, we don't do that. We go to the police. And yes, the victim will take the stand under oath and identify the accuser, but they're in a court and they're protected. The structures that we have in place in the secular are so much more safer for victims than we do in church. We know that God is exposing the church because all of this junk has to come out first before it can spill over into the secular. And the secular has given us a picture of what that looks like in courts. The victims are safe. They have an advocate with them. I believe that these ministries, they just use their platforms for manipulation. They have the opportunity to repent. They have an opportunity to do what's right. Instead, they stall and they cover up and they twist God's word for their benefit and to continue to abuse. If only Mike Bickle and Dave Sliker had taken their own advice, practiced what they preached about humility. I remember, I'm summarizing, I just remember Facebook posts of Dave Sliker all the time talking about being humble and humility and people bringing an accusation to him and how he handles it. I am laughing because he is such a liar. That is not what he did in any of this. I remember on Facebook, before he blocked me, This was before the exposure. He would talk about how if somebody would come to him, he would say, I acknowledge what you're saying to me. It's valid, and they're going to talk about it. That is not what he did with these people. These victims are people he knew. He treated them worse. There's no words of how he treated them. So you must be a liar. So back to the report, we see how these victims, they're discouraged from going to the police. They're discouraged from even talking about these crimes. And that reminds me of something that one of the whistleblowers said in regard to the Cassis, how Drenda Cassis accused her of, didn't like her living with somebody because she thought that they would be talking about Drenda. You know, they just want to shut us all up. That's what they want. They're going to call us liars because they're liars. They're going to call us as trying to make money, but that's what they do. Every single thing that they accuse the victims of, the ones who stand up for the victims, they're guilty of that. So in conclusion, in this report, Firefly concludes that Mike Bickle has, in fact, committed spiritual, emotional, and SA within IHOPKC going back to the 1970s. They found that he systematically groomed and developed inappropriate relationships with women. I would say he groomed children, and he groomed their parents as well. They found that he used prophetic language to speak to victims, isolated victims from others. All of these tactics, buying them gifts, supplying them with apartments, isolating them, controlling their behavior, giving them public praise and attention, touching them. These are all things that he did to manipulate and groom them. And they concluded that his letter, where he acknowledged inappropriate behavior, was an attempt to minimize what he did. They found that both Mike Bickle and ELT they had deliberate indifference and minimized reports of sexual abuse, requiring victims to confront their offenders and discourage them from going to police. Their action or lack thereof contributed to an unsafe environment. I'd say that was hell. They go on and outline strategies that they recommended that IHOPKC implement. So the question is whether they will at this point. Who's even there in charge to do that? I don't know. If we're leaving it into the hands of Kurt Fuller, you know, the one who called the advocate group liars, well, you really think that he's going to implement anything to protect victims? They hate victims. If they hate victims, if they hate the oppressed, do they hate God? Do they hate Jesus? At this point, I can't imagine any parent allowing their child to go to IHOPKC or to any place where you have heard that there is an allegation of SA, any kind of spiritual abuse, any kind of cover-up. The only way to stop them is to affect their money. That is the only way. Stop paying them. Stop buying their merchandise. Stop going to their conferences. The Firefly Report is great, but what happens next? What is going to happen next? I think that this is not the end of it. I think there's going to be more conversations about it, and I hope there is, and I'll be looking out for that. And I'm interested to hear your comments as well. I think there might be a documentary made on it, and I think there should, because that's how we learn things. And vital information is revealed in documentaries. I like watching documentaries. I believe that people should continue to be educated about all of these things, what's entailed in this outlined in this report, and learning from all the other ones that are out in social media. That's how we're learning about it, because the secular news is not reporting on it. So we have to report on this. We have to. This is not gossip. We're talking about things that are happening right now. These are important things. We have to talk about how to educate ourselves, protect ourselves and our children, and to stop this from happening. So those are my thoughts. Share with me what perhaps your thoughts are, and we can continue this conversation, and it might lead to another video on this. So I hope that this was helpful to you, and I'll see you in the next video.